Welcome to lecture number 69. We are starting a new historical period that runs from 1890 to 1945. This is historical topic 7.1, Contextualizing Period 7. There is one learning objective, that is, explain the context in which America grew into its role as a world power. This is the most important development according to the College Board in this time period. This lecture will provide background information on all of the events that lead to the U.S. rising as a world power. The first key concept is growth expanded opportunity, while economic instability led to new efforts to reform U.S. society and its economic system. The economy continued to expand through industrialization and management structures of the Gilded Age. Sometimes the rapid growth was a result of overspeculation bubbles that were followed by economic crashes. The Panic of 1893 is in the overlapping period of Units 7 and 8. The main economic downturn of this historical period will be the Great Depression, which follows a period of great economic expansion in the 1920s. The Roaring Twenties, as they're called, were another time in which the economy expanded, and the new glamour of the decade was expressed through their fashions like those of the flapper girls. This era came to an end with a crash in the stock market, and it reverberated through the economy, impacting even those Americans that did not invest in stocks. Reforms to fix inequities and instability in the economy happened in two waves. The first starts at the end of the 19th century, which focuses on eliminating monopolies and trusts that were so common in the Gilded Age. The second happens in the 1930s in response to the Great Depression under Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal. Both of those are covered in an upcoming key concept. As this key concept suggests, there are also reforms targeting U.S. society as a whole. Some of these reforms are to bolster democracy in the United States. The 17th Amendment changed the way that U.S. senators were chosen to be directly elected by the voters in a state as opposed to being appointed by the state legislature. The 19th Amendment, adopted in 1920, guaranteed the right to vote for women, though some states had already begun to grant that privilege. One moral reform created through a constitutional amendment was prohibition. The 18th Amendment allowed Congress to ban the sale of alcohol across the United States, which it did through the Volstead Act in 1919. Another constitutional amendment that worked to implement reform was the 16th Amendment, which allowed for the implementation of an income tax. One of the primary reasons an income tax was necessary was as a form of income for the government, since President Wilson, a Democrat, favored lowering the tariff, which used to be the government's main form of income. Initially, the income tax only affected the wealthiest classes of society, so it served to decrease economic inequality. The second key concept says the United States continued its transition from a rural agricultural economy to an urban industrial economy led by large companies. The 1920 census showed that for the first time in U.S. history, there were more people living in cities than there were in rural areas. This was as a result of factories concentrated in the cities attracting more workers. The mechanization of farming in the rural areas also required fewer people to perform that farm labor. Trusted monopolies like Rockefeller, Standard Oil, and Carnegie's U.S. Steel already existed and drove growth. In this time period, new companies like the Ford Motor Company introduced new production methods that expand the growth of this urban industrial economy. A new trend emerges in these companies of using scientific management to increase productivity. Frederick Winslow Taylor, seen in the bottom right, acts as a consultant for factories to give suggestions as how to make their process more efficient to maximize profits. The next key concept covers the Progressive Era. It's generally regarded to be the first 2 decades of the 20th century. The key concept says, in the Progressive Era of the early 20th century, progressives responded to political corruption, economic instability, and social concerns by calling for greater government action and political and social measures. There was a new momentum in the movement to regulate big business. Legislation and agencies were created in the previous period, but they had not been properly used to regulate trusts and monopolies. In 1887, the Interstate Commerce Act created the Interstate Commerce Commission to regulate railroads, though it's not until the early 20th century in which it's used to regulate the rates that they were charging. The political cartoon on the bottom left captures this by showing the railroad executives going to Uncle Sam to ask for permission to raise their fares. In the period before, railroads could set their own rates and artificially raise them in regions where there was no competition. The 1890 Sherman Antitrust Act had defined what trusts were, what monopolistic activity looked like, and despite its earlier use to weaken unions, eventually it is used to break up Rockefeller's Standard Oil and Thomas Edison's General Electric. President Teddy Roosevelt and Taft from 1901 to 1913 used the Sherman Antitrust Act to limit the amount of trusts in the economy. Its use continued into the late 20th century to break up big companies like AT&T in 1982. Progressives and unions shared common goals as both call for safer working conditions, the 8-hour workday, and an end to child labor. The next key concept jumps straight into the Great Depression and the response to it. During the 1930s, policymakers responded to the mass unemployment and social upheavals of the Great Depression by transforming the U.S. into a limited welfare state, redefining the goals and ideas of modern American liberalism. The Great Depression was sparked by the stock market in October 1929. It led to massive unemployment up to 25%. Out west, farmers were dealing with the Dust Bowl caused by prolonged drought and decades of dry farming techniques that exhausted the soil to the point that it resembled sand. Republican President Herbert Hoover had a limited response to unemployment, which was in line with the laissez-faire ideology of the 1920s. Hoover believed that the economy would self-correct and that any meddling from the government would just prolong the downturn. The American people weren't quite as patient as he was, so they elected Franklin Roosevelt, or FDR, in 1932. It's FDR's response that the key concept refers to in creating a limited welfare state, which redefined the goals and ideas of modern American liberalism. In the first 100 days of the Roosevelt administration, he put in place this policy called the New Deal, which offered relief for the short term, recovery to avoid another depression, and long-term recovery. At his behest, Congress passes legislation that creates new agencies that employ unemployed Americans in building infrastructure projects and gives them direct cash payments. Social Security creates the foundations of that social safety net. It was guaranteed basic income for people who were over the age of 65, funded through payroll taxes. The idea is that workers pay into the system to pay for those who are currently over 65, and then when they reach 65 or retirement, they get monthly payments for having contributed to the system earlier in their working life. It greatly reduced the rate of poverty because it helped those who were no longer able to work or have an income. The next key concept says innovations in communication and technology contributed to the growth of mass culture, while significant changes occurred in internal and international migration patterns. Technologies in this period were ones that had been invented in the previous period, but the relevant development is that they become more widely adopted. The telephone, for example, had been invented and successfully tested in 1879 by Alexander Graham Bell, but its use was expanded tremendously with the first transcontinental, long-distance phone call from New York to San Francisco in 1915. Automobiles are more widely used and accessible as a result of the developments by the Ford Motor Company. The Ford Model T cost about $500 at the time for the first 2 decades of the 20th century. That's equivalent to around $5,000 to $15,000 today, depending on the year and the rate of inflation. The availability of the car creates a transportation revolution. The faster means of transportation and communication increase the rate in which popular culture is spread. Some of those specific examples are covered in the following key concept. The largest internal migration pattern in this period is the First Great Migration, in which African Americans moved to cities in the North to escape poor economic opportunities and discrimination in the South. The migration was fueled by the First World War, when northern factories looked to replace workers who had gone off to war. The concentration of African Americans in condensed city neighborhoods create new communities that lead to new cultural movements. The Harlem Renaissance was one such movement that came out of the Harlem neighborhood of New York City. African American writers, poets, singers, and musicians from various parts of the country converged in the neighborhood and influenced each other to produce influential works. Examples of poets and artists in the Harlem Renaissance include poet Langston Hughes, writer Zora Neale Hurston, and musician Louis Armstrong. The next key concept expands on the rise of popular culture and its effect on society. Popular culture grew in influence in the United States society even as debates increased over the effects of culture on public values, morals, and American national identity. Consumerism continued to grow, and it has the effect of spreading popular culture. Consumerism isn't new at this point in U.S. history, but the rate of consumerism increases during this period. It creates a culture in which people are encouraged to buy the latest popular fashions or the newest household goods like record players and later radios to listen to the new popular music. Jazz was one such new genre of music. It was developed in New Orleans by musicians like Jelly Roll Morton and was later made more popular by musicians like Louis Armstrong and Ella Fitzgerald. Popular trends weren't popular with everyone, and there was a backlash against the fashions of the flapper. The clothes were more revealing and loose-fitting than previous fashions that were influenced by the Victorian era. The combination of revealing fashions and dancing to new genres of music led some to criticize them as deviant or promiscuous. There's also a backlash to other developments in American society. In response to the growing adoption of Darwin's theories on evolution, evangelical Christian groups organized to keep it out of the school curriculum through state laws. The Scopes monkey trial was a court case which tried a high school science teacher over the teaching of evolution in a Tennessee high school. It becomes a high-profile case covered by the new mass media. Former Secretary of State and 3-time presidential candidate William Jennings Bryan goes to Tennessee and volunteers to lead the case for the prosecution. Once Bryan joins the case for the state, the most famous lawyer in the country, Clarence Darrow, joins the case as lead counsel for the defense of John Scopes. Eventually, Scopes is convicted because he had clearly broken the law and admitted to it. But the trial evolved, pun intended, into one that tried the theory of evolution as a valid theory in the face of Christian teaching from the Bible. The next key concept says economic pressures, global events, and political developments caused a sharp variation in the numbers, sources, and experiences of both international and internal migrants. The primary internal migrants in this period are African Americans. They moved to northern cities from southern states to escape the oppressive systems of sharecropping and tenant farming, or economic pressures, as the key concept categorizes these push factors. Other push factors include threats of violence and discrimination. The second iteration of the KKK was founded in 1915 on top of Stone Mountain outside of Atlanta, Georgia. The new Klan also espoused anti-Catholicism, anti-Semitism, and nativism. Lynchings continued from the late 19th century, and documented cases will continue into the next historical period. Their experience varies, with segregation and discrimination not totally absent in northern states. Even when African Americans volunteered to fight in World War I and World War II, they had to do so in segregated units. The picture on the top right shows the 555th Parachute Infantry Battalion, and on the bottom right were the Tuskegee Airmen, which were both all-black units that fought in World War II. International migrants continued to come for primarily Southern and Eastern Europe until the limitations on immigration were made official in 1921. They sought better economic opportunities in the United States and looked to escape religious discrimination in the case of Eastern European Jews. Nativist sentiment from the previous period is still present in the 20th century. After World War I, the anti-immigrant sentiment combines with the fear of the spread of communism. The Red Scares were periods in which there was widespread fear that communism could spread through various parts of the U.S. government and threaten U.S. democracy. The first Red Scare, which happened after World War I, and spread the fear that European migrants who had been exposed to communism in Europe would import it into the United States. The combination of nativism and the Red Scare created enough support in Congress to implement restrictions on immigration. In 1921 and 1924, the United States Congress passes Immigration Quota Acts. It created a cap for total migrants allowed from every country in the Eastern Hemisphere. Each country could now send only 3% of the total migrants that had entered the U.S. in 1910. The 1924 Act further restricted it by 2%. The next key concept says, participation in a series of global conflicts propelled the U.S. into a position of international power while renewing domestic debates over the nation's proper role in the world. This key concept covers a large part of what the learning objective is trying to accomplish. Aside from the economic and industrial growth previously covered, one of the ways in which the United States rises to prominence is through a successful series of wars in this historical period. First is the Spanish-American War in 1898. It's fought in the Caribbean and Pacific Ocean. It began because of the United States' criticism of Spain over the treatment of Cubans' independence movement. Cuba was a Spanish colony at the time. The USS Maine, an American battleship docked near the port of Havana, Cuba, sinks as a result of an explosion. The United States blames the Spanish and declares war. The U.S. naval superiority yields a quick victory over Spain and allows it to take over their imperial holdings in the Philippines, Guam, and Puerto Rico, while giving Cuba its independence. When World War I broke out in 1914, President Wilson kept the U.S. neutral until 1917. U.S. entrance proved decisive in tipping the balance against the Germans and the Austro-Hungarians. The U.S. ended the war as the richest and most powerful country in the world, but at the end of the war, the U.S. chose the path of isolationism. Americans and a slight majority of politicians saw the death toll that World War I created and wanted to avoid further diplomatic ties that could lead to another outburst of war. World War II started in 1939 in Europe, partly due to the failings of the peace drawn at the end of World War I. The U.S. is kept neutral once again, this time by President Roosevelt. A declaration of war isn't issued until December 1941, when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. At the conclusion of that war in 1945, the United States once again emerges as the preeminent world power, but this time chooses to step into its role instead of retreating into isolationism. The next key concept says, in the late 19th century and early 20th century, new U.S. territorial ambitions and acquisitions in the Western Hemisphere and the Pacific accompanied heightened public debates over America's role in the world. Territorial ambitions and acquisitions in this period include the annexation of Hawaii and territorial gains as a result of the Spanish-American War. The war with Spain leaves the U.S. with the Philippines and Guam in the Pacific Ocean, Puerto Rico in the Caribbean, and a lasting influence in independent Cuba. The political cartoon on the top right is from Spain and criticizes the U.S. for using the war as a way to grab overseas territories. A debate inside the country was happening simultaneously on the imperial actions of the United States and whether or not they were proper. The only reason the U.S. had grown so large in power to contemplate an overseas empire was because of the growth of its Navy. When Teddy Roosevelt was the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, he gets the Navy to purchase and build a new fleet of ships outfitted with the latest technologies. Roosevelt himself was influenced by Alfred Thayer Mahan's book, The Influence of Sea Power Upon History. When the Spanish-American War started, Teddy Roosevelt resigned his post as Assistant Secretary of the Navy, a prestigious position, and decides to start his own regiment called the Rough Riders. He trained his regiment in Texas and recruited college graduates, cowboys, African Americans, and Native Americans to fight in the upcoming war. When the war starts, they can't fit their horses on the ships going to Cuba, and so they end up fighting as an infantry unit despite their name. The next key concept talks about the next major military conflict, World War I. World War I and its aftermath intensified ongoing debates about the nation's role in the world and how best to achieve national security and pursue American interests. The United States entered over Germany's unrestricted submarine warfare, which was interfering with American commerce. An intercepted telegram called the Zimmermann Note suggests that the German minister was inviting Mexico to attack the United States, and in return, Germany would help Mexico regain territory that they had lost in 1845 as a result of the Mexican-American War. For that reason, the United States enters into the war and proves to be the difference maker in defeating Germany. At the end of the war, President Wilson has a hand in peace negotiations and the Treaty of Versailles. His hopes for the treaty was more idealistic than the end product, but his idea of a multinational organization called the League of Nations was included. He pushed for the United States to join the multilateral effort to keep peace around the world. But politicians back home did not see it the same way and chose isolationism after World War I. The U.S. had to make a separate peace with Germany, and the U.S. absence from the League of Nations leaves the organization weak. The United States absent in the world stage slows the recovery in Europe after the war, both economically and physically. Depressed conditions in Europe allowed leaders like Hitler to rise to power and ultimately lead the world to World War II. After World War I, the side that preferred a smaller role in world affairs had effectively won, and the U.S. pursued an isolationist foreign policy. The last key concept about World War II shows that the U.S. shed the isolationist policy and took its place as a world leader. U.S. participation in World War II transformed American society, while the victory of the United States and its allies over the Axis powers vaulted the U.S. into a position of global, political, and military leadership. The first major way in which it transformed American society is that the federal spending and war manufacturing that the U.S. put in place to get ready for the war is what gets the United States out of the Great Depression. It brought in a new era of prosperity, and it leads to the U.S. becoming the world's strongest power. The number of women in the workplace rises during the war because men are off fighting. After the war, they make way for returning veterans. The quick expansion in social freedom and equality and its quick reversal inspires a new generation of women to ask for more equal rights. The effects will mostly be seen in the next historical period. The war also encourages minority groups like African Americans to ask for more equality to live up to the rhetoric about democracy the U.S. was promoting in fighting the war. African Americans led the double V campaign, V for victory. The first victory is victory abroad, and then the second victory is victory at home. There's some progress in ending discrimination in hiring in some industries as a war measure, but the greatest expansion in the protection of equal rights happens in the next historical period. The war ended in August 1945 when Japan surrendered after the U.S. dropped 2 nuclear bombs, one in the city of Hiroshima and one in Nagasaki. Similarly to the First World War, the U.S. emerges as one of the strongest powers because it doesn't have to endure the fighting in their home territory, but now also because of this new powerful weapon they've developed. The U.S. looks to keep a large influence in world affairs after the war, unlike World War I. It makes it a priority to keep peace around the world through collective security. We co-found and join organizations like the United Nations to ensure that if there is conflict in the future, it can be resolved diplomatically. The Marshall Plan is later implemented as a financial resource for European countries in their rebuilding to build goodwill and keep communism from taking hold in countries that struggle economically. Alright, here's the recap of everything that is coming up in this historical period. The United States economy continued to experience boom and bust cycles, though beginning to implement reforms in the Progressive Era. Internal migrations were fueled by discrimination in the Great Depression. International migrations were further restricted by the Quota Acts. The New Deal attempted to curb unemployment and created social safety nets. The Spanish-American War proved America's place as a world power. The U.S. entered World War I reluctantly, and they revert to isolationism as a conclusion of the war. And finally, the U.S. entered World War II over Pearl Harbor, and after the war they accept their role as a world leader. Thank you for watching. If you would like to watch the next lecture, you can click the video link on the screen. And if you're looking for more practice to help you on the AP exam, you can visit apushslides.com. I wish you the very best in all of your studying and look forward to seeing you back in the next lecture.